So the Canadian government is finally taking a strong stand with the lawless trucker protests against vaccines. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. If you share my concerns, maybe you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, maybe even click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So as a child, I actually lived for some time in Toronto, Canada. And when I moved to the United States, I was in 8th grade. So I'm very familiar with the differences in culture between Canadians and Americans. We like to think about Canadians as being incredibly polite. In fact, my son tells a joke about a Canadian traffic jam where you have 4 people sitting at a traffic light with each saying, "You go first, no, you go first, no, you go first." In some respects, though, I think this view of Canadians is actually misunderstanding their culture on some fundamental issue, much the way that we Americans sometimes fundamentally misunderstands the French, for example, who in reality are not nearly as rude as we Americans like to imagine sometimes. In truth, Canadians are opposed to confrontation. Their culture is decidedly non-confrontational, which is quite a contrast from their neighbor to the south, where we love confrontation. We celebrate confrontation here. We have TV shows like Tucker and Hannity and reality TV that feed off of controversy. So that's kind of a fundamental difference between our culture here in the United States and that in Canada. Let me give you a direct example. I remember at one point, I had gone back up to Toronto with my family, and I was sitting with my then probably 5 or 6-year-old son on a bench in the Eaton Centre, the large shopping mall that they have in Toronto. My wife and daughter were in one of the stores looking at clothes or something, I think. So my son and I are kind of playing around and fooling around on the bench. And I had sitting on the bench next to me a folded up newspaper that I'd bought just earlier and just hadn't had a chance to read yet. Out of the blue walks some Canadian who just happened to be in the mall, and he picks up the newspaper that was sitting right next to me and starts walking away with it. I look up at him and say, "What are you doing?" in my typical American confrontational fashion. He immediately put down the newspaper and practically ran away, kind of mouthing some kinds of excuses to himself, going, I'll never forget that because it was such a illustration of the difference between Americans and Canadians. It's not that he didn't want to assert his position or anything, it's just that Canadians avoid confrontation, whereas Americans really aren't afraid of it. So the kind of protests that we're seeing in Canada right now are something very different from what they're used to. Canadians love to look at American protests, like the Black Lives Matter protests, or what happened in Charlottesville, and they're absolutely appalled by it. Frankly, I'm appalled by what happened in Charlottesville too, but that's a story for a different video. They love to kind of look down on us in that regard and say, oh, those Americans, they're always causing trouble. We don't do that type of thing here in Canada. So it's absolutely shocking to them that such a protest would be occurring in their country. What's more is that they're incredibly ill-equipped to address it as a result of that. Unlike American protests, where we've kind of come to expect that there are limits to how you can assert your freedom to express your opinion. You can't, for example, shut down commerce between two countries. And if you did, Americans would have no problem with you being arrested and carried away. Well, in Canada now, they've literally been blocking the Ambassador Bridge, which is located just a few miles away from where I live here in suburban Detroit. The Ambassador Bridge is important because it is literally the route over which 25% of the trade between the United States and Canada traverses. You have to remember, Canada is still our #1 trading partner. And for the auto industry located here in Michigan, parts will go back and forth as they're built into a new vehicle. That's kind of the legacy of NAFTA. Well, blocking the bridge as a result of that has literally resulted in a crippling crisis for the auto industry, where the auto industry has struggled with inflation, with trying to get semiconductors. All of a sudden, they're finding that their supply chain, which goes back and forth between Canada and the United States, has been stopped, dead in its tracks. It's worth noting, by the way, that this is not some mass protest. This is basically a small number of Canadian truckers supported by and organized by some right-wing, racist, neo-Nazi groups in Canada, and as it turns out, supported by funding from the American right wing, including Christians, of course. But these right-wing groups have long been looking to gain some sort of traction in Canada the way that they have in the United States. The unhappiness of a small group of truckers with a vaccine mandate has given these right-wing groups kind of an issue that they can run on. And we've seen them change their slogans from neo-Nazi and racist representations instead to signs focusing on their freedom, of course. Well, it's worth noting that 90% of Canadian truckers are vaccinated. What's more is this vaccine mandate only applies to truckers who are going back and forth over the US and Canadian border. In other words, what the government has said is to come back into Canada from the United States, you need to be vaccinated. And that's a rule, by the way, that has long applied to airline employees and most other Canadians. In fact, my sister and her family, who still live in Toronto, came down to the United States for Christmas. And they had trouble getting back into Canada because they had to do this kind of balancing act of coordinating when they got their tests versus when they got the test results back versus returning into Canada within a certain period of when the tests were taken. See, this is the inconvenience that the truckers don't like. They don't like the fact that they have to be slightly inconvenienced. And essentially the compromise that the Canadian government has made, rather than requiring these truckers to get these tests within a certain period of time the way that my sister and her family had to, is they just say, hey, if you're fully vaccinated, don't worry about it. Fully vaccinated people can come back and forth across the border as many times as they want. So again, we're talking about a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of truckers, since 90% of them are already vaccinated in Canada, and the majority of truckers only travel within Canada. So it's only that small percentage of truckers who are unvaccinated and who travel between the United States and Canada. Now, the reason they've been able to cause so much chaos, of course, is because they drive these huge rigs. And if you have a couple of people parking these huge rigs on a bridge, you can see how they can shut down traffic on that bridge pretty quickly. Now, I must admit, I share the frustration of many Canadians and Americans, by the way, with the refusal of the Canadian government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to essentially be stronger with these protesters. And they've allowed these protests to go on pretty much unaddressed for the last 2 weeks. But again, there's that Canadian propensity not to want to engage in confrontation. So finally, we're starting to see officials from the provincial government of Ontario, as well as the city government in Windsor, which is the city directly opposite Detroit on the other side of the Ambassador Bridge, to address this crisis more forcefully. They've said that these truckers will be arrested and that they face losing their driver's license. So they've got to make a hard choice as to how far they want to go to avoid getting a minor couple pricks in your arm. Now, I have no doubt that there will be some percentage of them who would rather be arrested and lose their driver's license than comply. There always are that small number, and I'm sure we'll focus on those people, but the vast, vast majority of them, as we've seen time and again here in the United States when different organizations have imposed vaccine mandates, will just decide, hey, let's get the vaccine. And that makes sense, because it's not unreasonable for the government of Canada to say, we want to stop the virus from coming into Canada and killing as many people as it has in the United States. We have to remember the fact that Canada has been incredibly successful in stopping the virus, and although many of its measures have been inconvenient to say the least to Canadians, as a result, their death rate is 1/3 per capita that of the United States. So their policies, although inconvenient, have been incredibly successful. My hope, though, is that this incredibly damaging behavior by a small group of people, behavior, by the way, that some in the right wing want to bring here into the United States as well, is finally going to create a real schism between the business community and these right-wing crazies. Many businesses, General Motors included, by the way, have tried to essentially walk that fine line where they claim, oh, we are in favor of democracy and opposed to racism, but yet we're going to quietly give donations to those same people who opposed the ratification of President Biden's election on January 6th. At a certain point, these organizations are going to have to take a stand, and they're going to have to decide, do we really want to side with these right-wing crazies, or are we going to be better off with a society governed by the rule of law with a stable democratic government? And my guess is they'll choose that. Well, if you like this video, maybe you'd want to check out this one on the vaccine mandates here in the United States. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.